Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Society. Tonight, we're drifting down through cool, shifting waters into one of the ocean's most magical hidden worlds. If you find these gentle journeys into science comforting, I invite you to like this video or subscribe to help others discover this quiet corner of wonder. But for now, let your breathing slow, allow your shoulders to drop, and imagine yourself descending through shafts of filtered sunlight into an underwater forest, unlike any woodland you've ever seen on land. We're entering the realm of kelp forests, those towering cathedrals of the sea that rise from rocky ocean floors and stretch toward dancing waves above. These aren't forests in the traditional sense. They're not made of trees with roots and branches. Instead, they're formed by massive algae, ancient organisms that have been perfecting their craft for millions of years. These giant brown seaweeds create structures so immense, so complex, and so teeming with life that they rival the biodiversity of tropical rainforests. As you settle in tonight, picture yourself floating weightlessly among these swaying golden brown fronds, surrounded by shimmering fish, playful otters, and the gentle rocking motion of the sea. This is where we'll spend our time together, exploring one of Earth's most productive and mysterious ecosystems. Kelp forests line about a quarter of the world's coastlines, forming a vital ribbon of life that encircles much of the temperate and subpolar zones of our planet. Around 740 million people live within 50 kilometers of these underwater ecosystems, often without realizing the silent work these forests perform just offshore. They grow in waters that are cold and nutrient-rich, thriving where conditions would seem harsh and inhospitable to many forms of life. Yet in these places, kelp doesn't just survive. It explodes with growth and abundance, creating forests that pulse with energy and motion. Tonight, as you rest, we'll discover how these forests can grow faster than almost anything else on Earth. How they support creatures ranging from microscopic plankton to the largest whales, and how they quietly protect coastlines, feed communities, and even fight climate change. We'll learn about the delicate balances that keep these ecosystems healthy, the threats they face, and the remarkable ways they recover from disaster. Let your mind wander through these underwater groves. Allow the information to wash over you gently, settling in the quiet spaces of your thoughts like sediment drifting to the ocean floor. There's no need to hold on to every detail. Just let the wonder of it all carry you into rest. The architecture of kelp is a marvel of evolutionary engineering. When you first encounter a kelp plant, which scientists call a thallus, rather than using traditional plant terminology, you're witnessing a structure refined over countless generations to thrive in the perpetual motion of the sea. Unlike the plants that dominate terrestrial forests, kelp belongs to a different kingdom entirely. It's not a plant, but a large brown alga, a member of the phylum Ochrophyta. This distinction matters because it reveals how different evolutionary paths can arrive at similar solutions. Where trees developed roots, trunks, and branches, kelp developed structures that serve comparable purposes but work in fundamentally different ways. At the bottom, anchoring the kelp to the rocky seafloor, you'll find the holdfast. This root-like structure looks remarkably similar to the roots of land plants, but appearances can be deceiving. The holdfast doesn't absorb water or nutrients from the substrate. Instead, it functions purely as an anchor, a biological grappling hook that clings to rocks with impressive tenacity. The structure develops over time, starting small when the kelp is young and gradually expanding as the plant grows. New Haptera. The finger-like projections that form the holdfast continuously grow and branch, wrapping around and over existing structures, weaving themselves into an increasingly complex mass that can resist enormous forces from waves and currents. The strength of this attachment is truly remarkable. A mature giant kelp holdfast can withstand pull forces equivalent to several hundred pounds. Anchoring a plant that might stretch 60 or more feet to the surface and expose a huge surface area to moving water. The Haptera don't penetrate the rock like roots penetrate soil. Instead, they grow across its surface, following every contour, filling every tiny depression, and creating friction through sheer surface contact. Some species of kelp can even attach to relatively smooth surfaces through the production of adhesive compounds, though most prefer rough, irregular substrate that provides more anchor points. Within its tangled, grasping fingers, an entire miniature ecosystem flourishes. The holdfast creates a three-dimensional habitat with countless crevices, channels, tunnels, and chambers, each providing shelter for organisms of different sizes with different requirements. Brittle stars weave their long, flexible arms through its channels, emerging to feed on passing plankton or detritus while keeping their central discs hidden in the holdfast's protection. Sea stars of various species cling to its surfaces, some feeding on the many smaller organisms that colonize the holdfast, others simply using it as a secure resting place. Anemones attach themselves to protected spaces within its structure, extending their tentacles into the water to capture passing prey while keeping their vulnerable bodies tucked away. Sponges colonize its crevices. These simple but ancient animals filtering water through their bodies and extracting tiny food particles. The sponges themselves become habitat for even smaller organisms, creating layers of ecological complexity. Tube-dwelling worms construct their homes among the Haptera, extending feathery feeding appendages when conditions are favorable and retreating into their tubes when threatened, and sea cucumbers nestle in holdfast chambers, processing detritus and sediment. Countless smaller invertebrates, many invisible to the casual observer, make their homes throughout the structure. Amphipods, tiny shrimp-like crustaceans, swarm in large numbers. Isopods, related to terrestrial pillbugs, crawl across surfaces. Tiny snails graze on microscopic algae. Minute crustaceans called copepods drift through the spaces between Haptera. A single large holdfast, the kind that anchors a mature giant kelp that might be 5 or 6 years old, can harbor over 150 species of invertebrates. Scientists studying holdfast communities have found biodiversity levels that, when compared at similar spatial scales, rival those of tropical coral reefs. This extraordinary diversity exists in a space often no larger than a bushel basket, demonstrating how structural complexity creates ecological opportunity. Each species occupies its particular niche within the holdfast, some feeding on detritus, others hunting prey, still others filtering plankton from passing water. Predators hunt among the haptera. Herbivores graze on algae coating the surfaces. Scavengers consume dead organisms. Filter feeders process water. All these organisms interact, forming a complex community maintained by the habitat the holdfast provides. The holdfast also serves as a nursery for many species. Juvenile organisms too small to survive in more exposed environments find refuge among its protective structures. As they grow, they may venture out into the broader kelp forest or beyond. But during their most vulnerable early stages, the holdfast offers shelter that dramatically improves survival. For some species, the holdfast isn't just important habitat, but essential habitat. The only place where certain life stages can successfully complete development. Researchers have identified species that seem to exist almost nowhere else. Holdfast specialists whose entire life cycles depend on these structures. From the holdfast rises the stipe, analogous to a tree's trunk but far more flexible. Where a tree trunk is rigid, designed to resist wind and support its own weight against gravity, the kelp stipe bends and flows with the surging water. It must be strong enough to resist being torn away by waves and currents, yet flexible enough to move with the ocean's rhythms rather than fight against them. This combination of strength and flexibility allows kelp to survive in environments where rigid structures would quickly break. The stipe extends upward, sometimes reaching extraordinary heights. In optimal conditions, a single kelp plant can grow taller than a 10-story building, creating a vertical structure that transforms the underwater landscape. Along and at the top of the stipe, you'll find the fronds, those leaf-like or blade-like structures that give kelp forests their characteristic appearance. These fronds are where most of the kelp's photosynthesis occurs, where sunlight is captured and transformed into the energy that fuels the entire ecosystem. The fronds wave and ripple with every surge of water, creating a hypnotic dance that never stops. As sunlight filters down through the ocean's surface, it illuminates these fronds from above, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the seafloor below. Fish dart through the columns of light. Shadows move across the rocky bottom in slow, rhythmic waves. The entire forest breathes with the pulse of the sea. Many kelp species have evolved an additional feature that proves crucial to their success. Gas-filled bladders called pneumatocysts provide buoyancy, lifting the fronds toward the surface where light is most abundant. These pneumatocysts act like tiny balloons distributed throughout the kelp's structure. In giant kelp, each frond has its own gas bladder at its base, allowing individual fronds to reach toward the light. In bull kelp, a single large pneumatocyst at the top of the stipe supports multiple fronds near the surface. This adaptation allows kelp to create a canopy at the ocean's surface while remaining anchored to the floor below, essentially creating a multi-story forest structure. The canopy provides habitat for some species. The midwater column, with its swaying stipes and drifting fronds, provides habitat for others. The shadowy floor beneath offers refuge for still others. This vertical complexity is part of what makes kelp forests such biodiversity hotspots. Different kelp species have adopted different life strategies, each adapted to particular conditions and challenges. Giant kelp, perhaps the most famous species, is perennial, meaning a single plant can live for several years. In ideal conditions, giant kelp can survive for 7 years or more, continuously producing new fronds while older ones decay and slough off. This perennial strategy works well in areas where winter storms are less severe, allowing the kelp to maintain its hold on the substrate year after year. Bull kelp, in contrast, is annual. Each plant completes its entire life cycle in a single year, growing rapidly in spring and summer, reproducing in fall, and then dying back in winter. This annual strategy proves advantageous in northern waters, where fierce winter storms regularly scour the seafloor, ripping away established kelp. By completing its reproduction before the worst storms arrive, bull kelp ensures its survival even in harsh conditions. The spores released in fall settle to the seafloor, waiting through winter to begin growing again when conditions improve. The diversity of kelp species worldwide reflects the diversity of conditions they've adapted to. There are approximately 30 different species of kelp around the globe, though the exact number depends somewhat on how taxonomists define species boundaries. Laminaria dominates the coasts of the Atlantic Ocean and appears along the coasts of China and Japan. Ecklonia thrives in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Macrocystis, the giant kelp, appears throughout the northeastern and southeastern Pacific Ocean, in southern ocean archipelagos, and in scattered patches around Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The greatest diversity of kelp species exists in the northeastern Pacific, from north of San Francisco, California, to the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. Here, over 20 species coexist, creating some of the most complex and productive kelp forest ecosystems anywhere on Earth. The growth rate of kelp ranks among the most extraordinary phenomena in all of biology. When conditions are right, kelp doesn't just grow. It explodes upward with a speed that seems to defy the laws of nature. Giant kelp, in ideal circumstances, can grow 18 inches in a single day. Think about that for a moment as you settle deeper into rest. 18 inches in one rotation of the Earth. That's faster than you can watch it happen. Yet if you were to sit beside a kelp forest for several days, you would see visible change. You could watch the forest expand, reach higher, spread wider. This growth rate is achieved through cells dividing and elongating at a furious pace, with kelp adding roughly 2% of its body weight in new tissue every 24 hours. To put this in perspective, imagine a young giant kelp plant starting the growing season at just a few feet tall. Under optimal conditions, with cold water, abundant nutrients, and long days of sunlight, this plant could reach the surface, perhaps 60 feet away, in just a few months. Some individuals have been measured growing from the seafloor to the surface in as little as 4 months, creating a towering structure where none existed at the season's beginning. This speed of development allows kelp forests to respond rapidly to changing conditions, filling available space quickly and creating habitat that wasn't there just weeks before. The growth isn't uniform across the kelp plant. The primary growing region is located in a specialized zone just above where the fronds branch from the stipe, called the meristematic region. Here, cells divide most rapidly, producing new tissue that elongates as cells mature. The fronds grow from their bases rather than their tips, continuously adding new tissue while older tissue at the frond tips ages and eventually degrades. This pattern means that a kelp frond is a record of time, with the newest, youngest tissue near the stipe and progressively older tissue toward the tip. Scientists can sometimes read environmental conditions from kelp tissue, with variation in growth rates visible as subtle bands in the tissue, much like tree rings record annual growing conditions. This incredible growth requires enormous amounts of energy and nutrients, demanding that kelp be extraordinarily efficient at capturing both. The photosynthetic machinery in kelp fronds rivals that of the most productive crop plants in its efficiency. Kelp can absorb up to 40% of the light energy that strikes its fronds, an impressive proportion given the various losses inherent in any energy conversion system. The large surface area of kelp fronds maximizes light capture, with some giant kelp plants having a total frond surface area of several hundred square feet, all working simultaneously to gather sunlight and convert it to chemical energy through photosynthesis. But light is only half the equation. Kelp also requires substantial quantities of dissolved nutrients, particularly nitrogen in the form of nitrate and ammonia, phosphorus as phosphate, and various trace elements and minerals. Unlike terrestrial plants that gather nutrients from soil through their roots, kelp absorbs nutrients directly from seawater through its fronds. The surface of kelp fronds is specialized for this purpose, with cells capable of active nutrient uptake, transporting dissolved substances from the waters into the kelp's tissues even when nutrient concentrations in the water are relatively low. The availability of these nutrients varies dramatically with location and season, and this variation drives much of the seasonal pattern in kelp growth. Along the Pacific coast of North America, spring and summer bring conditions of coastal upwelling, where winds and ocean currents drive surface water offshore and allow deeper water to rise and replace it. This deep water, which hasn't seen sunlight in months or years, is cold and extraordinarily rich in nutrients that have accumulated from decomposing organic matter sinking from surface waters. When this nutrient-rich water reaches the sunlit zone where kelp grows, it fuels explosive growth. Kelp forests expand rapidly during upwelling seasons, with individual plants showing their maximum growth rates and forests reaching their greatest density and extent. As summer transitions to fall and eventually winter, upwelling weakens or stops in many regions. Nutrient concentrations in surface waters decline as kelp and other photosynthetic organisms deplete them faster than they're replenished. Growth rates slow. Some older fronds die back. Storm activity increases, particularly in winter, breaking off fronds and sometimes tearing entire plants from their holdfasts. Giant kelp, being perennial, survives these slower periods, maintaining a reduced canopy that will expand again when conditions improve. Bull kelp, being annual, completes its reproductive cycle in fall and then dies back entirely, leaving only microscopic spores on the seafloor to wait through winter and germinate when spring returns. Temperature also affects kelp growth in complex ways. Kelp grows best in cold water, typically between 8 and 14 degrees Celsius, though the optimal temperature varies among species. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen and carbon dioxide than warm water, both important for kelp metabolism. But temperature's effect goes beyond simple chemistry. Kelp has evolved to thrive in cold conditions, and its metabolism, from enzyme function to cell division rates, is tuned to these temperatures. When water warms beyond kelp's optimal range, growth slows even if nutrients and light remain abundant. The kelp expends more energy on basic maintenance and less on growth. Reproduction may be impaired. The plant becomes more susceptible to disease, stress, and grazing. This temperature sensitivity explains why warming oceans pose such a threat to kelp forests globally. Light availability, the third key factor in growth, changes with water clarity, weather, season, and depth. Near the surface, where light is most abundant, kelp can photosynthesize at its maximum rate during sunny days. Deeper in the water column, light intensity decreases. In clear water, sufficient light for kelp growth might penetrate to 100 feet or more. In turbid water, kelp might struggle to grow at depths beyond 30 feet. Seasonal changes in the day length affect total daily light availability, with long summer days providing many more hours of photosynthesis than short winter days. Cloud cover, storms, and seasonal changes in water clarity all modulate the light-reaching kelp, creating temporal variation in growing conditions. The productivity achieved through this combination of rapid growth and efficient resource use is staggering. Kelp forests capture approximately 500 grams of carbon per square meter per year on average through photosynthesis, though peak productivity during optimal growing seasons can reach much higher values. To contextualize this, intensive agricultural systems like cornfields capture similar amounts of carbon. Tropical rainforests, often considered the pinnacle of terrestrial productivity, capture comparable or only slightly higher amounts per unit area. Yet kelp achieves this productivity without soil, without terrestrial root systems, and in an environment of constant motion where maintaining position requires continuous structural investment. This incredible productivity doesn't benefit only the kelp itself or the creatures living directly in the forest. Much of the organic matter produced by kelp is exported as detritus, pieces of decomposing kelp that drift with currents and settle to the seafloor. Older fronds constantly shed tissue. Entire fronds break off, particularly during storms. Even living tissue continuously sloughs off cells and mucus. All this material enters the detrital pool. This kelp-derived particulate organic matter becomes food for organisms living far from the forests themselves. Deep-sea creatures dwelling thousands of feet below the surface feed on kelp fragments that sink to the ocean floor. Scientists examining deep-sea sediments far from shore have found identifiable kelp fragments, evidence of how far this productivity can spread. Beach-dwelling organisms consume kelp wrack washed ashore by waves and storms, creating complex food webs in the intertidal zone supported partly by kelp forest productivity. Researchers have tracked kelp-derived nutrients into organisms living on islands far from kelp forests, demonstrating that seabirds feeding on kelp-associated fish transport those nutrients inland through their guano. The productivity of kelp forests thus ripples outward, supporting life across vast areas of the coastal ocean and even influencing terrestrial ecosystems on nearby shores and islands. This export of productivity makes kelp forests ecologically important far beyond their physical boundaries. Kelp forests exist around the world, forming a discontinuous band around temperate and polar coastlines. They require specific conditions to thrive, and where those conditions are met, forests can form with remarkable consistency. The first requirement is cold water. Kelp grows best in water temperatures below about 20 degrees Celsius, though the optimal temperature varies somewhat among species. This explains why kelp forests dominate along coastlines, where cold currents flow or where upwelling brings deep, cold water to the surface. The second requirement is hard substrate. Kelp holdfasts must attach to something solid, typically rocky seafloor or reefs. Sandy or muddy bottoms don't provide the anchor points kelp needs, so forests rarely form in these areas. The third requirement is relatively shallow water with sufficient light. Although kelp forests can exist in waters up to about 130 feet deep in exceptionally clear conditions, they are typically found in much shallower waters, often between 30 and 60 feet deep. Light diminishes rapidly as it penetrates water, and kelp, like all photosynthetic organisms, needs adequate light to fuel its growth. Finally, kelp requires a steady supply of nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. These nutrients become available through upwelling, river runoff, and the recycling of organic matter within the ecosystem. Where all these conditions converge, cold, clear, shallow water over rocky substrate with abundant nutrients, kelp forests flourish. Along the Pacific coast of North America, kelp forests stretch from Alaska to Baja California, creating one of the longest continuous kelp forest ecosystems anywhere. In North America's national marine sanctuaries, including Monterey Bay, Channel Islands, Greater Farallones, Chumash Heritage, and Olympic Coast Sanctuaries, visitors and researchers can witness these forests in their full glory. On the other side of the Pacific, kelp forests line the coasts of Japan and China. Southern Hemisphere kelp forests thrive along the coasts of Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and South America, including the cold waters around Tierra del Fuego and the Falkland Islands. In the North Atlantic, kelp forests grow along the coasts of Norway, Ireland, and northeastern North America. For many years, scientists believed kelp forests were restricted to cold waters, making them absent from tropical and subtropical regions. But in 2007, researchers made an astonishing discovery near the Galapagos Islands. They found thriving kelp forests in tropical waters, something that challenged existing understanding of kelp ecology. These tropical kelp forests exist in deeper water where temperatures remain cool despite the tropical latitude. Cold, nutrient-rich water from ocean depths flows to these locations, creating pockets of suitable habitat in otherwise unsuitable regions. This discovery opened new questions about where else kelp might be growing unnoticed and how kelp forests might serve as climate refuges in a warming ocean. The total extent of kelp forests worldwide covers approximately 43% of the world's marine ecoregions, representing a vast, globally distributed ecosystem. These forests occur on coastlines of every continent except Antarctica, though they're most extensive and diverse in the North Pacific. The importance of this global distribution cannot be overstated. Kelp forests provide ecosystem services and support biodiversity across much of the world's temperate coastline, affecting human communities and marine life on a planetary scale. Charles Darwin, during his voyage on the Beagle, encountered kelp forests off the coast of South America and was struck by their ecological importance. On June 1, 1834, near Tierra del Fuego, Chile, he wrote observations that still resonate today. He compared the kelp forests to tropical rainforests and concluded that the destruction of a kelp forest would cause even more species to perish than would the destruction of a terrestrial forest. He wrote that among the leaves of kelp live numerous species of fish that could find food and shelter nowhere else, and that with their destruction, the many cormorants and other fishing birds, the otters, seals, and porpoises would soon perish, and the Fuegian people would decrease in numbers and perhaps cease to exist. Darwin recognized something fundamental about kelp forests. They're not just habitat. They're the foundation upon which entire coastal ecosystems and human communities are built. The biodiversity supported by kelp forests astonishes anyone who takes the time to observe them carefully. These underwater forests harbor a greater variety and higher diversity of plants and animals than almost any other ocean community. Over 800 species of fish, invertebrates, and marine mammals depend on kelp forests for food, shelter, or nursery habitat. This number likely underestimates the true diversity because it doesn't account for all the microscopic organisms, the bacteria, the tiny invertebrates, and the countless species that haven't yet been thoroughly studied or cataloged. When researchers conduct comprehensive biodiversity surveys of kelp forests, meticulously identifying every organism they can find, the species lists grow remarkably long, sometimes including hundreds of species from a single forest. Fish species abound in kelp forests, using the three-dimensional structure in myriad ways. Rockfish, a diverse group of over 100 species in the Pacific, find shelter among kelp fronds and feed on smaller fish and invertebrates. These fish, members of the genus Sebastes, display remarkable variety. Some rockfish species are brightly colored in reds, oranges, and yellows, standing out vividly against the golden brown kelp. Others wear camouflage patterns that make them nearly invisible against the kelp, their mottled colors and subtle patterns allowing them to ambush prey or avoid predators. Black rockfish school in midwater, sometimes forming large aggregations that move through the forest in coordinated groups. Copper rockfish prefer rocky areas within forests, lurking in crevices and among holdfasts. Blue rockfish, despite their name often appearing more grayish or brownish, patrol the water column, feeding on small fish and crustaceans. Kelp bass, a species given away by its name, is strongly associated with kelp forests along the Southern California coast. These fish are popular targets for recreational anglers, who seek them among the fronds where the bass hunt smaller fish. Adult kelp bass can reach weights of 15 pounds or more, making them formidable predators within the forest. They're ambush hunters, using the kelp structure to conceal themselves before striking at passing prey. Young kelp bass find shelter deep within the forest, where the dense fronds protect them from larger predators. As they grow, they gradually move toward forest edges and more open water. But they maintain their association with kelp throughout their lives. Señoritas, brightly colored rasa with distinctive blue and orange markings, provide cleaning services throughout the forest, picking parasites and dead tissue from larger fish. These cleaners establish stations where other fish come to be cleaned, hovering motionlessly while the señoritas work over their bodies. This mutualistic relationship benefits both parties. The cleaners gain food, and their clients gain improved health. Some fish will travel considerable distances to visit cleaning stations, demonstrating the value of this service. Señoritas also feed on small invertebrates, zooplankton, and algae, making them important generalist predators and consumers in the kelp forest food web. Kelp surf perch, members of a family of fish that give birth to live young, use kelp forests as both feeding and breeding habitat. Females carry developing embryos internally, and when ready, they release fully formed juvenile fish among the kelp fronds. These young fish can swim and feed immediately, but they remain in the protective cover of dense kelp during their early life, reducing their vulnerability to predators. Adult surf perch feed on small crustaceans, mollusks, and worms found among the kelp, using their strong jaws to crush hard-shelled prey. Multiple species of surf perch coexist in kelp forests, each with slightly different preferences for depth, substrate type, and prey, allowing them to partition resources and reduce competition. Other fish use kelp forests as temporary residents or visitors. Pacific herring spawn along kelp-covered coasts, attaching their sticky eggs to kelp fronds and underwater vegetation. These spawning events can be massive, with entire sections of a coastline becoming thick with eggs. The eggs hatch into larval herring that initially drift with currents before developing into juvenile fish that school in nearshore waters. Salmon pass through kelp forests during their migrations, particularly juvenile salmon moving from rivers to the open ocean and adults returning to spawn. Larger predators like leopard sharks, with their distinctive spotted patterns, hunt along kelp forest edges, searching for fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. Several species of rays, including bat rays with their distinctive wing-like pectoral fins, patrol sandy areas adjacent to kelp forests, using electroreceptors to detect prey buried in sediment. Some fish have evolved specialized adaptations for life in this environment. The kelp clingfish, a small fish rarely longer than a few inches, has developed a suction disc on its belly that allows it to cling tightly to kelp fronds even in surging water. This adaptation prevents it from being swept away by waves and currents that would otherwise dislodge such a small fish. The clingfish feeds on tiny invertebrates found on kelp surfaces, moving slowly across a fronds and using its suction disc to maintain position regardless of water movement. Pipefish and seahorses, relatives of each other with elongated snouts adapted for sucking up tiny prey, hide among kelp fronds and attached algae, their body shapes and colors providing camouflage. These fish are sit-and-wait predators, remaining motionless until small crustaceans or plankton drift within striking distance. The invertebrate community in kelp forests displays even greater diversity than the fish community, with representatives from nearly every major group of marine invertebrates. Sea urchins, those spiny echinoderms we've discussed extensively, occur in multiple species with different colors, sizes, and habits. Purple sea urchins, small and often brightly colored, are among the most abundant grazers in many Pacific kelp forests. Red sea urchins, which can grow much larger and live for decades, also graze kelp but at different rates and with different preferences. These urchins feed by scraping algae and kelp tissue with their Aristotle's lanterns, those remarkable five-toothed structures in their mouths. When well fed, urchins maintain relatively small body sizes. When food is scarce, as in urchin barrens where they've consumed most available kelp, urchins can shrink, reducing their body size to survive on minimal food. Abalone, those large sea snails prized for their beautiful shells and delicious meat, creep slowly across rocks and kelp surfaces, grazing on algae and small kelp fragments. Several species of abalone inhabit kelp forests along the Pacific coast, each with slightly different habitat preferences and shell characteristics. Red abalone, the largest species, can reach shells over 12 inches across. Black abalone prefer shallower water and more exposed coastlines. White abalone, now critically endangered, once lived in slightly deeper water than most other species. All abalone species have seen dramatic population declines due to overharvesting, disease, and environmental changes, making them subjects of intensive conservation and restoration efforts. Sea stars in multiple species and brilliant colors cling to rocks and kelp holdfasts throughout forests. The sunflower sea star, before being devastated by sea star wasting disease, was one of the largest and most impressive predators in Pacific kelp forests. These massive stars, sometimes over 3 feet across with more than 20 arms, actively hunted sea urchins, helping control their populations. They moved surprisingly quickly for sea stars, pursuing prey across the seafloor. Bat stars, smaller and typically colored in mottled reds, oranges, and purples, scavenge dead organisms and hunt small invertebrates. Ochre stars, common in intertidal zones, also venture into kelp forests where they prey on mussels, barnacles, and other sessile organisms. Each sea star species plays its role in the ecosystem, some as top predators, others as scavengers, all contributing to the complex web of interactions. Brittle stars, with their long, sinuous arms radiating from small central discs, hide in crevices throughout kelp forests and emerge to feed. Unlike sea stars, which move using tube feet, brittle stars can move by rowing with their flexible arms, achieving surprising speed when threatened. They feed by capturing passing particles with their arms or by depositing materials into their mouths. Some species are predatory, others are detritivores, and many are opportunistic, consuming whatever food source is most readily available. Anemones attach to rocks and kelp stipes, extending their tentacles to capture passing zooplankton and small fish. These conidarians, relatives of jellyfish and corals, contain stinging cells called nematocysts in their tentacles. When prey touches a tentacle, thousands of nematocysts fire simultaneously, delivering toxins and harpoon-like structures that capture and paralyze the prey. The tentacles then draw the food to the anemone's mouth. Anemones can live for many years, growing slowly and sometimes becoming quite large. Some species harbor photosynthetic algae in their tissues, gaining an energy from their symbionts, while others depend entirely on captured prey. Crustaceans of many kinds find homes in kelp forests. Kelp crabs, colored in shades of red and brown that match the kelp, clamber along fronds and stipes, feeding on kelp tissue and smaller organisms. Decorator crabs attach pieces of kelp and other organisms to their shells as camouflage. Spiny lobsters hide in rocky crevices during the day and emerge at night to hunt. Amphipods, tiny shrimp-like crustaceans, swarm in huge numbers through kelp forests, forming an important link in the food web between algae and larger predators. Mysids, another group of small crustaceans, drift in clouds above the kelp canopy. Mollusks beyond abalone contribute to kelp forest diversity. Sea slugs in psychedelic colors, nudibranchs crawl slowly across kelp and rocks, feeding on sponges, hydroids, and other prey. Octopuses, those masters of camouflage and intelligence, hunt through kelp forests at night, squeezing into impossibly small spaces in search of crabs and fish. Squid patrol the edges of forests, hunting in coordinated groups. Countless species of small snails graze on algae, reproduce among the kelp, and provide food for larger predators. Marine mammals find kelp forests irresistible, forming some of the most visible and charismatic associations in these ecosystems. Sea otters, perhaps the most iconic kelp forest residents, spend their entire lives in and around these ecosystems, rarely, if ever, coming ashore. Their relationship with kelp forests is so intimate that it defines both the otter's ecology and the forest's structure. They rest by wrapping themselves in kelp fronds, which anchor them in place and prevent them from drifting away while they sleep. This behavior is endearing to watch, as otters wrap themselves securely, sometimes covering their eyes with their paws, bobbing gently with the waves while completely at peace. Often, several otters will rest together, forming rafts of resting animals that drift as a group within the kelp canopy. Sea otters hunt urchins, crabs, clams, and other invertebrates in the forest, spending much of their day foraging. They dive repeatedly to the sea floor, often to depths of 60 feet or more, though they can dive even deeper when necessary. Each dive might last 1 to 2 minutes as the otter searches holdfasts, rocky crevices, and sandy patches for prey. When successful, they bring their food to the surface along with a rock, which they've learned to use as a tool. Floating on their backs, they place the rock on their chest and use it as an anvil to crack open the hard shells of urchins, crabs, and mollusks. This tool use, remarkable in any marine mammal, has been passed down through generations, with young otters learning the technique by watching their mothers. The importance of kelp forests to sea otters extends beyond just providing hunting grounds. The forests offer protection from predators, particularly sharks, which are less likely to enter dense kelp. The forests reduce wave action, creating calmer waters where otters can rest and groom more easily. Grooming is essential for otters because, unlike other marine mammals, they lack a thick, blubber layer for insulation. Instead, they depend entirely on their dense fur, the densest of any mammal with up to 1 million hairs per square inch. To maintain this fur's insulating properties, otters must spend hours each day grooming, trapping air bubbles within the fur that provide warmth. In calm waters protected by kelp, this grooming is easier and more effective. Female sea otters give birth to pups in kelp forests, and mothers care for their young exclusively, without help from males. For the first several months, a pup depends entirely on its mother, unable to dive or feed itself. The mother must hunt constantly to support both herself and her growing pup, which she leaves floating in kelp canopy while she dives for food. Kelp provides crucial protection for these vulnerable pups, preventing them from drifting away and offering some concealment from predators. The pup's survival depends on the mother's ability to find sufficient food in the surrounding forest and the safety provided by the kelp's embrace. Harbor seals, those rotund marine mammals with spotted coats and large, expressive eyes, haul out on rocks near kelp forests and hunt fish among the fronds. Unlike sea otters, seals can and do come ashore, but they spend much of their time in the water, particularly when foraging. They're skilled hunters, pursuing fish through kelp forests with remarkable agility despite their seemingly cumbersome appearance on land. In water, their streamlined bodies and powerful flippers propel them through the densest kelp with ease. They can hold their breath for many minutes, diving repeatedly to capture prey. Harbor seals are generalist predators, consuming a variety of fish species, squid, and crustaceans depending on availability. Their presence in kelp forests reflects the abundance of prey these ecosystems support. Sea lions, both California and stellar species depending on location, patrol kelp forest waters with even greater swimming prowess than seals. Sea lions are pinnipeds, like seals, but belong to a different family characterized by external ear flaps and larger front flippers that provide greater agility in water. California sea lions, the smaller and more southerly species, are particularly acrobatic swimmers, twisting and turning through kelp with speed that seems impossible for their size. They hunt schooling fish, often working cooperatively to herd prey into tighter groups before striking. Their loud, barking vocalizations, produced both in water and on shore, help maintain group cohesion and communication. Stellar sea lions, much larger and occupying more northern waters, are less acrobatic but equally skilled hunters, capable of taking larger prey, including salmon and even small sharks. Both sea lion species form breeding colonies on rocks, islands, or beaches near kelp forests. Males establish territories during breeding season, defending patches of shoreline where females gather. The dramatic displays of male sea lions, with their loud roaring, aggressive posturing, and occasional violent fights, contrast sharply with their graceful underwater movements in kelp forests. Pregnant females give birth on shore shortly after arriving at breeding colonies. then alternate between nursing pups on land and foraging trips in nearby kelp forests and open waters. The proximity of productive kelp forests to breeding colonies is crucial, allowing females to find sufficient food to support lactation while remaining close enough to return regularly to their pups. In some regions, elephant seals and fur seals also utilize kelp forest areas, though less extensively than sea lions and harbor seals. Elephant seals, the largest pinnipeds, are deep-diving specialists that forage primarily in open ocean, but juveniles sometimes rest and feed in kelp forest areas. Fur seals, more pelagic than most pinnipeds, occasionally pass through or forage near kelp forests, particularly in the California Channel Islands and other regions where kelp forests occur near deep water. Even large whales interact with kelp forests in ways that are increasingly recognized. Gray whales, those massive baleen whales that undertake one of the longest migrations of any mammal, travel past kelp forests along their routes between Arctic feeding grounds and Mexican breeding lagoons. During their southbound migration in fall and winter, gray whales pass close to shore, often swimming through or near kelp forests. In some areas, gray whales have been observed feeding on mysides and amphipods, small shrimp-like crustaceans that concentrate above kelp canopies. These feeding aggregations can attract multiple whales, creating spectacular wildlife viewing opportunities. Humpback whales, another baleen whale species, have also been observed near kelp forests, particularly where prey fish congregate at forest edges. Humpback whales employ various sophisticated feeding techniques, including bubble net feeding, where groups of whales work together to corral fish. When fish seek refuge in kelp forests, humpbacks sometimes feed at forest margins, though they're too large to enter dense kelp. The relationship between large whales and kelp forests extends beyond direct interaction. Whale feces, rich in nutrients, can stimulate phytoplankton productivity in surrounding waters. This nutrients might eventually support kelp growth, creating an indirect connection between these massive animals and the forests. Birds, too, depend on kelp forests, though from above rather than within. Cormorants dive into kelp forests to hunt fish, their sleek bodies arrowing through the water. Brown pelicans plunge from the air to capture fish near the surface. Gulls and terns patrol above kelp forests, watching for opportunities. Snowy egrets and great blue herons wade in shallow waters at forest edges. These birds form an important connection between ocean and land, transferring nutrients and energy from marine to terrestrial ecosystems through their droppings and through carcasses that wash ashore. Many species use kelp forests as nursery habitat, where young individuals find food and shelter during their vulnerable early life stages. Juvenile rockfish hide among kelp fronds, feeding on tiny crustaceans while avoiding predators that hunt larger fish. Young lingcod shelter in kelp forests before moving to deeper water as adults. Dungeness crab megalopae, the last larval stage before becoming juvenile crabs, settle in kelp forests where they have better survival than in open areas. The structural complexity of kelp forests provides hiding places at many scales, from tiny crevices for larval organisms to larger refuges for juvenile fish. This incredible biodiversity isn't randomly distributed but reflects complex webs of interaction. Every species plays roles in the ecosystem, often multiple roles. A fish might be a predator of smaller invertebrates, prey for larger fish or seals, a host for parasites, and a disperser of nutrients through its waste products. A sea urchin grazes kelp, provides food for otters, hosts bacteria in its gut, and becomes nutrients for scavengers when it dies. These interconnections create resilience and stability. When one species declines, others can sometimes compensate, maintaining ecosystem function even in the face of change. Among all the creatures that inhabit kelp forests, one stands out for its disproportionate influence on the entire ecosystem. The sea otter, that endearing marine mammal with the dense fur and playful behavior, functions as what ecologists call a keystone species. A keystone species is one whose impact on its ecosystem is much larger than would be predicted by its abundance alone. Remove the keystone, and the entire arch collapses. Remove sea otters from a kelp forest, and the ecosystem transforms into something utterly different. Sea otters feed primarily on invertebrates, particularly sea urchins. An adult otter consumes roughly 25% of its body weight in food each day, maintaining its high metabolism and keeping warm in cold ocean waters. For an adult otter, this means eating dozens of sea urchins daily. Otters dive to the seafloor, often to depths of 60 feet or more, searching holdfasts and rocky crevices for urchins. When they find one, they bring it to the surface along with a rock, then float on their backs while using the rock as an anvil to crack open the urchin's spiny shell. This behavior, tool use in a marine mammal, never ceases to charm observers. Sea urchins, when not controlled by predators, are voracious consumers of kelp. Their mouths, complex structures called Aristotle's lanterns with 5 teeth arranged in a circle, are perfectly designed for grazing algae. Urchins can chew through kelp stipes, causing entire plants to break free and drift away. When urchin populations explode, they can consume kelp forests faster than the kelp can grow, creating what researchers call urchin barrens. These barrens are underwater deserts where kelp and most other algae have been eliminated, leaving only bare rock covered by encrusting coralline algae and enormous numbers of urchins. The biodiversity of urchin barrens is a fraction of that found in healthy kelp forests. Where there might have been hundreds of species in a thriving forest, the barren might support only dozens. The relationship between otters, urchins, and kelp demonstrates a trophic cascade, where changes at one level of the food web cascade through multiple levels below. When otters are abundant, they keep urchin populations low through predation. With urchins controlled, kelp flourishes, creating habitat for the diverse community of species we've been exploring. But when otters decline or disappear, urchin populations explode. These now numerous urchins overwhelm the kelp's ability to grow, consuming forests and creating barrens. With the kelp gone, all the species that depended on it for food and habitat decline or disappear. The ecosystem flips from one dominated by kelp to one dominated by urchins. This trophic cascade has been observed and studied extensively along the Pacific coast of North America, where the history of sea otters provides a natural experiment in ecosystem dynamics. Before European colonization, sea otters were abundant from Japan across the northern Pacific to Baja California. Indigenous peoples hunted otters, but apparently at sustainable levels that didn't eliminate otter populations or trigger ecosystem changes. Then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the maritime fur trade targeted sea otters for their luxurious pelts, the densest fur of any mammal. Hunters killed otters by the hundreds of thousands. By the early 20th century, sea otters were nearly extinct, surviving in only a few small, isolated populations. With otters gone, urchin populations exploded across much of the former otter range. Kelp forests that had thrived for millennia were consumed, transforming into urchin barrens. The ecological consequences rippled through coastal ecosystems. Fisheries declined as habitat disappeared. Coastal communities that had relied on kelp forest resources for generations saw those resources vanish. The transformation was so complete that when researchers began studying kelp forests in the mid-20th century, many assumed that urchin barrens were the natural state in some regions, not realizing they were observing ecosystems fundamentally altered by otter extirpation. In 1911, international treaty protection saved sea otters from complete extinction. Protected populations began slowly recovering, and in later decades, otters were translocated to portions of their former range to speed recovery. As otters returned to certain areas, researchers witnessed the reverse transformation. Urchin populations declined under predation pressure. Kelp forests regrew. Biodiversity increased. The cascading effects of otter recovery extended beyond just kelp and urchins. Fish populations increased. Birds returned. The entire ecosystem shifted back toward its historical state, demonstrating both the importance of top predators and the resilience of ecosystems when given a chance to recover. However, the story hasn't ended happily everywhere. In the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, sea otter populations that had recovered strongly in the late 20th century began declining again in the 1990s. Researchers eventually determined that killer whales, those apex predators even more powerful than otters, had begun preying on sea otters in unprecedented numbers. The hypothesis for this behavioral shift suggests that industrial whaling in the decades following World War II had removed most of the great whales from the North Pacific. Killer whales, which previously fed on large whales, needed to find alternative prey. They expanded their diet to include smaller marine mammals, including sea otters. Even though an otter provides much less food than a whale, killer whales can catch them more easily. This predation drove otter populations down dramatically in some regions, triggering the cascade again. Urchins increased, kelp declined, and ecosystems transformed. These dynamics illustrate how complex marine ecosystems are, how actions at one level, whether human hunting of otters or whales, cascade through multiple layers of the food web, sometimes producing effects far from the initial impact. They also show how slowly some ecosystems recover. Even decades after protection and restoration efforts began, some kelp forests haven't returned to their historical extent and health. The transformation from forest to barren can happen in months or years, but the reverse transformation often takes much longer, if it happens at all. Urchin barrens themselves, once established, can be remarkably stable. The urchins in a barren are often in poor condition, barely surviving on the limited food available. Yet they persist because even the smallest amount of kelp growth is quickly consumed before it can establish. The urchins essentially maintain the barren state through their presence, preventing kelp recovery. Some urchin barrens have persisted for decades, requiring active intervention to reverse. In several locations, conservation organizations and research groups have implemented urchin removal programs, where divers physically remove urchins from areas targeted for kelp restoration. These efforts can work, allowing kelp to reestablish, but they're labor-intensive and expensive. The scale of the problem often exceeds the capacity of removal programs, requiring more comprehensive solutions. The rate at which urchin barrens can form is truly alarming. In certain conditions, a herd of sea urchins can move across the seafloor consuming kelp at a rate of approximately 30 feet per month. Imagine watching a forest being consumed that quickly. Within a year, an area the size of several football fields can be transformed from thriving kelp forest to barren rock. The urchins move in waves, the front edge actively consuming kelp, while those behind clean up remnants. Some researchers describe it as similar to locusts moving across a crop field, leaving devastation in their wake. Different urchin species contribute to this phenomenon in different regions. Along the Pacific coast of North America, purple sea urchins and red sea urchins are the primary kelp grazers. In Norway and other parts of the North Atlantic, the green sea urchin plays this role. These urchins are naturally part of kelp forest ecosystems. In balanced systems, their grazing can be beneficial, removing old or damaged kelp and opening space for new growth. The problem arises when their populations lose natural regulation, when predators decline, or when other factors like climate change stress the kelp while favoring the urchins. Some research suggests that urchin barrens represent an alternative stable state, a concept from ecology describing ecosystems that can exist in multiple different configurations. In this framework, kelp forests and urchin barrens are both stable. An ecosystem could persist indefinitely in either state unless something pushes it across a threshold into the other state. Once in the barren state, returning to the forest state requires overcoming significant barriers. The urchins must be reduced, which requires predators or manual removal. But for kelp to reestablish, the right conditions must align: adequate nutrients, suitable temperature, available substrate, and the presence of kelp spores or nearby source populations. All these factors must come together during a window when urchin grazing pressure is low enough to allow kelp establishment. This concept of alternative stable states has profound implications for conservation and management. It suggests that preventing kelp forest loss is much more effective than trying to restore forests after they've been lost. Once the transition to barren occurs, restoration becomes difficult and uncertain. This makes protection of existing healthy kelp forests a priority, using tools like marine protected areas to maintain otter populations, prevent overfishing of urchin predators, and buffer ecosystems against other stressors. Beyond their intrinsic value and the biodiversity they support, kelp forests provide enormous benefits to human communities. These ecosystem services, the benefits humans derive from natural systems, are increasingly recognized and valued, both for their direct economic contributions and for their role in supporting human well-being. Economists have attempted to quantify the total value of kelp forests globally, arriving at estimates exceeding $500 billion. This staggering number reflects the many ways kelp forests contribute to human prosperity and quality of life. One of the most visible benefits kelp forests provide is support for commercial and recreational fisheries. Many economically important fish species depend on kelp forests for nursery habitat, feeding grounds, or shelter. Rockfish, harvested commercially and recreationally along the Pacific coast, spend much of their lives in kelp forests. Kelp bass, a popular sport fish, is named for its habitat preference. Lingcod, another commercially valuable species, feeds in kelp forests. Abalone and sea urchins, themselves harvested for food, live primarily in kelp forest ecosystems. The health of kelp forests directly affects the productivity of these fisheries, which in turn support coastal communities and economies. Beyond fish, kelp itself is harvested and used in numerous products. The kelp harvesting industry extracts compounds called alginates from kelp tissue. Alginates are used as thickeners, stabilizers, and emulsifiers in a remarkable range of products. Ice cream, yogurt, and salad dressings contain alginates. Toothpaste and cosmetics use them for texture and consistency. Pharmaceuticals use alginates in pill coatings and drug delivery systems. Beer brewers use them to clarify their products. Even industrial applications, from textile printing to welding rod coatings, rely on alginates derived from kelp. The kelp harvesting industry must balance extraction with sustainability, ensuring that harvesting doesn't damage forest ecosystems or reduce their ability to provide other services. Kelp forests protect coastlines from erosion, a service becoming increasingly valuable as climate change drives sea level rise and potentially more intense storms. Kelp forests reduce wave energy before waves reach the shore. The kelp itself, particularly the canopy-forming species, create drag on water movement, slowing currents and reducing the force of waves. Studies have shown that wave height can be reduced by up to 60% as waves pass through kelp forests. This wave attenuation reduces coastal erosion, protecting beaches, cliffs, and human infrastructure. In regions with valuable coastal property, this erosion prevention service has an enormous economic value. Protecting or restoring kelp forests can be far more cost-effective than building seawalls or constantly repairing storm damage. Kelp forests support tourism and recreation, providing opportunities for diving, snorkeling, kayaking, and wildlife viewing. People travel from around the world to dive in kelp forests, to experience floating through these underwater cathedrals and encountering their diverse inhabitants. Coastal communities benefit economically from this tourism through dive shops, guide services, accommodations, and other tourism-related businesses. The aesthetic and recreational value of kelp forests, while harder to quantify than fisheries or erosion prevention, contributes significantly to human well-being and coastal economies. In recent years, attention has focused on kelp forests' role in carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation. Like all photosynthetic organisms, kelp absorbs carbon dioxide from its environment and converts it into organic matter. The carbon fixed by kelp can follow several pathways. Some is consumed by herbivores and moves through the food web. Some is exported as detritus, drifting with currents. Significantly, some kelp fragments sink to deep water or are buried in sediment, where the carbon can be sequestered for long periods. Research suggests that kelp forests globally sequester substantial amounts of carbon, potentially comparable to tropical forests in their climate mitigation value. Giant kelp, in particular, captures carbon at rates estimated at 10 times higher than tropical forests per unit area. However, kelp's role in long-term carbon sequestration is complex and still being studied. Much of the carbon fixed by kelp is relatively quickly returned to the environment through decomposition and respiration. As kelp and the organisms that consume it break down organic matter, the proportion of kelp-derived carbon that ends up sequestered long-term in deep-sea sediments or other stable reservoirs is an active area of research. Even so, kelp forests' high productivity and their export of organic matter to surrounding ecosystems make them important components of coastal carbon cycles. As strategies for natural climate solutions develop, kelp forest protection and restoration are increasingly considered as potential carbon mitigation tools. Kelp forests also contribute to nutrient cycling in coastal waters. As kelp tissue breaks down, it releases nutrients that can be taken up by other organisms. Kelp detritus provides food for detritivores, organisms that consume dead organic matter, creating a foundation for complex food webs. The nutrients concentrated in kelp biomass, gathered from the water through photosynthesis and active uptake, are distributed through the ecosystem as kelp grows, is grazed, and decomposes. This nutrient cycling helps maintain coastal productivity even in areas where nutrient input from other sources varies seasonally. The cumulative value of these ecosystem services explains why the loss of kelp forests is of such concern. When a kelp forest is lost, all these benefits diminish or disappear. Fisheries decline. Coasts erode more rapidly. Tourism suffers. Carbon sequestration decreases. The full cost of kelp forest loss extends far beyond the simple loss of kelp biomass, encompassing all the cascading effects through ecosystems and human communities. Conversely, kelp forest restoration or protection provides the benefits that multiply through ecosystems and economies, making conservation a sound investment. Despite their resilience and productivity, kelp forests today face an array of threats that are causing declines in many regions around the world. A comprehensive analysis of kelpie forest change over the past half-century identified significant variation in trends across different regions. painting a complex picture of ecosystem responses to human impacts and environmental changes. Some kelp forests are expanding, taking advantage of new conditions or recovery from past disturbances. Others are stable, maintaining their extent and health despite ongoing pressures. But many are in decline, with losses in some areas exceeding 95% of historical coverage over just a few decades. Understanding these threats is crucial for developing effective conservation strategies, and the complexity of these challenges requires equally nuanced responses. Climate change emerges as one of the most serious and far-reaching threats to kelp forests globally. The relationship between kelp and temperature is fundamental to understanding this threat. Kelp thrives in cold water, with most species showing optimal growth between roughly 8 and 14 degrees Celsius, though specific temperature preferences vary among species and populations. These temperature requirements evolved over millions of years, shaping kelp's physiology, from the enzymes that drive its metabolism to the structural proteins that form its tissues. As ocean temperatures rise due to climate change, driven by increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations and other greenhouse gases, kelp faces physiological stress that manifests in multiple ways. Higher temperatures directly reduce kelp growth rates, even when other resources like nutrients and light remain adequate. The enzymes involved in photosynthesis and other metabolic processes function optimally within certain temperature ranges. Outside these ranges, enzyme efficiency declines, reducing the rate at which kelp can capture and process energy. Elevated temperatures also increase kelp's metabolic rate, meaning the plant expends more energy on basic maintenance functions, leaving less available for growth and reproduction. This creates a squeeze where energy input remains constant or decreases while energy expenditure increases, reducing the plant's net productivity. Temperature stress also impairs kelp reproduction, which for most species occurs through the release of microscopic spores that must settle on suitable substrate and develop into new plants. High temperatures can reduce spore production, decrease spore viability, or prevent successful settlement and growth of microscopic life stages. These early life stages are often more sensitive to temperature than adult plants, meaning that even if adults can survive warming conditions, recruitment of new plants may fail, preventing population replacement as adults die. Over time, this recruitment failure leads to population decline even in the absence of direct adult mortality. Warmer water increases kelp's susceptibility to disease and stress-related mortality. Various pathogens and diseases affect kelp, and many show increased virulence at higher temperatures. Additionally, temperature stress weakens kelp's defenses, making plants more vulnerable to infection or attack by grazers and pathogens they might otherwise resist. The combination of stressed hosts and more active pathogens can trigger disease outbreaks that devastate kelp populations, particularly when combined with other stressors. The upper temperature limit for kelp varies among species, reflecting their evolutionary histories and the conditions they adapted to. Species from cooler regions typically have lower temperature tolerances than species from warmer regions. But even within a species, populations from different parts of the range may show genetic variation in temperature tolerance, with populations from warmer locations showing somewhat greater heat tolerance than those from cooler areas. However, this existing variation may be insufficient to cope with the rate of warming occurring due to climate change. Evolution requires time, and when environmental conditions change faster than populations can adapt, local extinctions become likely. As climate change drives steady warming of coastal waters, kelp forests are shifting their distributions, generally moving toward the poles as waters at their warmer range edges become unsuitable. This poleward shift has been documented in multiple regions, with kelp expanding into areas that were previously too cold while disappearing from areas that have become too warm. However, this shift is not a simple translation of ranges toward cooler waters. Geography constrains where kelp can move, and not all regions have suitable habitat available poleward. Coastlines end, currents may not favor kelp dispersal, or substrate conditions may be unsuitable. This means that as kelp disappears from warming areas, the overall extent of kelp forests globally may shrink, even if some expansion occurs at poleward margins. Marine heat waves, periods of abnormally high ocean temperatures lasting weeks or months, have caused catastrophic kelp forest losses in multiple regions, demonstrating how acute thermal stress can trigger rapid ecosystem collapse. Unlike gradual warming, which kelp might potentially adapt to over many generations, marine heat waves impose sudden, severe stress that can kill kelp outright, or weaken it sufficiently that secondary effects finish the job. The Northeast Pacific marine heat wave from 2014 to 2016, often called the blob by scientists and media, provides a stark example of marine heatwave impacts on kelp forests. This event began with unusual atmospheric conditions that reduced wind mixing in the Northeast Pacific, allowing surface waters to warm substantially above normal. The warm water mass spread across the region and persisted for an unprecedented duration, with some areas experiencing elevated temperatures for over 2 years. Water temperatures in affected regions rose several degrees Celsius above normal, pushing kelp beyond its thermal tolerance in many locations. Along the coast from Alaska to California, kelp forests were devastated. Water temperatures remained elevated for extended periods, stressing kelp continuously while simultaneously favoring sea urchins and other grazers, which tolerate warmer water better than kelp does. In Northern California, this event triggered a cascade of changes that transformed the ecosystem. The kelp forests were already weakened by warm water and low nutrients associated with the heat wave and weak upwelling. Then, beginning in 2013, sea star wasting disease struck, killing vast numbers of sunflower sea stars, those important urchin predators we discussed earlier. The disease, whose exact cause remains debated but appears linked to environmental conditions including temperature, caused stars to develop lesions, lose arms, and eventually disintegrate. Sunflower star populations crashed along much of the Pacific coast, removing a key predator of sea urchins. With predators removed and kelp already stressed by temperature, purple sea urchins found themselves in favorable conditions. Their populations exploded, with densities in some areas reaching 60 urchins per square meter. far higher than in healthy forests. These enormous urchin populations consumed the weakened kelp forests, creating extensive barrens where forests had thrived for decades or longer. By some estimates, Northern California lost 95% of its bull kelp forests during this period, transforming vast stretches of coastline from productive forests to urchin-dominated barrens. As of the early 2020s, recovery has been slow and patchy, with many areas remaining as barrens, despite the marine heat wave having ended years earlier. This demonstrates how marine heat waves can flip ecosystems into alternative stable states that persist long after the initial disturbance ends. El Niño events, naturally occurring climate patterns that bring warm waters and reduced upwelling to parts of the Pacific coast, can also impact kelp forests, though typically less severely than marine heat waves. During El Niño years, weakened upwelling reduces nutrient availability, and warmer surface waters stress kelp. Strong El Niño events can cause temporary kelp forest declines, with reduced density and extent. However, most kelp forests recover after El Niño conditions end and normal upwelling resumes, because El Niño events typically last only 1 to 2 years, and temperature anomalies are usually less extreme than those seen in marine heat waves. But particularly severe El Niño events, especially if they interact with other stressors like overfishing or pollution, can cause longer-lasting changes or contribute to regime shifts. Climate change is expected to increase the frequency and intensity of marine heat waves globally, compounding the threat to kelp forests. As baseline ocean temperatures rise, marine heat waves will start from higher initial temperatures and push even further beyond kelp's tolerance. Additionally, climate change may alter El Niño patterns, potentially making extreme events more common or changing their geographic expression. These compounding effects suggest that temperature stress on kelp forests will likely intensify in coming decades, unless greenhouse gas emissions are dramatically reduced. Marine heat waves, periods of abnormally high ocean temperatures lasting weeks or months, have caused catastrophic kelp forest losses in multiple regions. The Northeast Pacific marine heat wave from 2014 to 2016, often called the blob, devastated kelp forests along the coast from Alaska to California. Water temperatures remained elevated for extended periods, stressing kelp while simultaneously favoring sea urchins, which tolerate warmer water better than kelp. In Northern California, this event triggered a cascade of changes. The kelp forests were already weakened by warm water and low nutrients. Then sea star wasting disease struck, killing vast numbers of sunflower sea stars, important urchin predators. With predators removed and kelp stressed, purple sea urchins exploded in population. These urchins consumed the weakened kelp forests, creating extensive barrens where forests had thrived. By some estimates, Northern California lost 95% of its bull kelp forests during this period. As of the early 2020s, recovery has been slow and patchy, with many areas remaining as urchin barrens. El Niño events, naturally occurring climate patterns that bring warm water and reduced upwelling to parts of the Pacific coast, can also impact kelp forests. Strong El Niño events reduce the cold, nutrient-rich upwelling that kelp depends on, leading to temporary kelp forest declines. Most kelp forests recover after El Niño conditions end and upwelling resumes, but particularly severe events can cause longer-lasting changes, especially if they interact with other stressors. Climate change is expected to increase the frequency and intensity of marine heat waves and potentially alter El Niño patterns, compounding these threats. Pollution poses another significant threat to kelp forests, though its effects vary depending on the type and source of pollution. Agricultural runoff and sewage discharge introduce excess nutrients into coastal waters, a process called eutrophication. While kelp needs nutrients, too much can be problematic. Excess nutrients can trigger harmful algal blooms that shade kelp or produce toxins. They can fuel the growth of turf algae, fast-growing seaweeds that can outcompete kelp for space and light. Turf algae can colonize areas after kelp is removed by storms or grazers, preventing kelp from re-establishing. In some regions, kelp forests are being replaced by turf-dominated systems, a transition driven in part by nutrient pollution. Sedimentation from coastal development also threatens kelp. When land is cleared for development, sediment washes into the ocean, increasing turbidity and settling on the seafloor. Increased turbidity reduces light penetration, limiting the depth at which kelp can grow and reducing photosynthesis. Sediment settling on kelp holdfasts can smother the spores and young kelp, preventing recruitment. In regions with extensive coastal development, sedimentation has contributed to kelp forest declines and prevented natural recovery. Overfishing, by removing predators of kelp grazers, can trigger trophic cascades similar to those caused by sea otter hunting. When fishing pressure removes urchin predators like sea otters in some regions, or large predatory fish like cod in others, herbivore populations can increase, leading to overgrazing of kelp. In some parts of the North Atlantic, overfishing of cod and other predatory fish has been linked to urchin population explosions and kelp forest losses. The creation of urchin barrens in Norway, for example, has been attributed in part to the collapse of cod stocks, which once helped regulate urchin populations. Similarly, fishing can impact kelp forests by removing herbivorous fish that help control other algae. The relationships are complex and vary by region, but the general principle holds. Removing species from ecosystems creates ripples that can affect kelp forests in unexpected ways. Marine protected areas, where fishing is restricted or prohibited, have shown benefits for kelp forests in multiple locations by maintaining more natural predator-prey dynamics. Invasive species represent another growing threat. As ships travel global routes, and as climate change shifts species distributions, organisms are introduced to new regions where they can become invasive, outcompeting native species or disrupting ecosystems. Invasive algae can be particularly problematic in kelp forests. Some invasive algae grow rapidly, reproduce prolifically, and can outcompete kelp for space and light. Japanese wireweed, native to the Northwest Pacific, has invaded Atlantic waters and rapidly spreads in some regions, altering kelp forest communities. Invasive herbivorous fish in some regions have increased grazing pressure on kelp beyond what the ecosystem evolved to sustain. Direct harvest of kelp, mentioned earlier as an industry providing benefits to humans, can also threaten kelp forests, if not managed sustainably. Kelp harvesting operations typically cut the top portion of the kelp canopy, leaving the stipes and holdfasts intact to regrow. When managed properly, this harvesting can be sustainable because of kelp's rapid growth. However, over-harvesting, taking too much kelp too frequently, can reduce kelp forest density and affect the ecosystem services the forest provides. Regulations on kelp harvesting vary by region and must balance economic benefits with ecological sustainability. The cumulative effect of multiple stressors can be more severe than the sum of individual stressors, a phenomenon known as synergistic effects. A kelp forest stressed by warming water might be more vulnerable to disease. Kelp, weakened by pollution, might be less able to withstand grazing pressure. These interactions make predicting kelp forest futures challenging and highlight the need for comprehensive management approaches that address multiple threats simultaneously. Global analyses of kelp forest trends show concerning patterns. A comprehensive study found that kelp forest abundance declined at an average rate of approximately 2% per year globally over recent decades, though with substantial regional variation. Some regions have seen increases, but many show declines, particularly at the warm edges of kelp's range. The study emphasized that trajectories vary considerably, reflecting the complex interplay of local drivers, global changes, and ecosystem-specific characteristics. This variation means that no single solution will protect all kelp forests. Instead, region-specific strategies are needed, tailored to local threats and opportunities. Understanding kelp forests as a part of a complex food webs reveals the intricate connections that make these ecosystems function. Energy flows through kelp forests along multiple pathways, creating a three-dimensional web of interactions. At the base sit the primary producers, kelp and other algae, along with phytoplankton in the water column. These organisms capture energy from sunlight through photosynthesis, transforming it into organic matter that fuels the rest of the ecosystem. Herbivores form the next level, consuming kelp and other algae directly. Sea urchins, as we've discussed, are major kelp grazers. But numerous other species also consume kelp or algae. Kelp crabs eat kelp tissue. Many snails graze on microscopic algae covering rocks and kelp surfaces. Isopods, small crustaceans, feed on kelp. Even some fish species, though often thought of as predators, include algae in their diets. The herbivores convert plant matter into animal tissue, making that energy available to carnivores. Carnivores occupy multiple levels. Some, like sea stars, feed on herbivorous snails and urchins. Fish eat smaller invertebrates. Larger fish eat smaller fish. Sea otters, as we've seen, primarily eat invertebrates. Seals and sea lions eat fish. This creates multiple trophic levels, with energy being transferred upward through the food web. At each transfer, most energy is lost as heat and metabolism. So only about 10% of the energy at one level typically makes it to the next level. This means that supporting a population of large predators requires a much larger biomass of prey species, which in turn requires an even larger biomass of primary producers. But food webs are more complex than simple linear chains. Many species feed at multiple trophic levels or change their diets with age or season. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. Scavengers consume dead organisms, recycling energy that might otherwise be lost. Detritivores feed on decomposing organic matter, whether kelp fragments, feces, or dead animals. This creates loops and connections throughout the web, with energy flowing in multiple directions simultaneously. The detrital pathway deserves special attention in kelp forests. A large proportion of kelp productivity isn't immediately consumed by herbivores, but instead enters the detrital pool. Kelp fronds constantly shed tissue. Entire fronds break off and drift away. Storms tear kelp from holdfasts. This kelp detritus becomes food for a host of organisms specialized in consuming dead organic matter. Some organisms shred kelp fragments into smaller pieces. Bacteria colonize the tissue, breaking it down chemically. Other organisms consume the bacteria-rich kelp particles. Through these processes, much of kelp's productivity supports food webs beyond the living forest itself. Kelp detritus drifts with currents, sometimes traveling substantial distances before settling. Kelp fragments have been found in deep-sea canyons far from the nearest kelp forest. Deep-sea organisms, living in an environment where food is generally scarce, depend partly on this rain of organic matter from surface waters. Kelp-derived material forms an important component of this input, supporting deep-sea food webs. On beaches, kelp wrack washed ashore creates habitat and food for shore-dwelling organisms. Beach hoppers, flies, and other invertebrates consume kelp tissue. Shorebirds feed on these invertebrates. Kelp detritus thus transfers energy from marine to terrestrial ecosystems, supporting biodiversity beyond the ocean's edge. Within the forest itself, the three-dimensional structure creates distinct microhabitats. The canopy, where kelp fronds spread across the surface, experiences highlight and wave action. Species living here must tolerate these conditions. The midwater, where stipes rise toward the surface, offers some protection from waves while still receiving adequate light. The forest floor, shaded by the canopy, is calmer but darker. Different species occupy these different zones, each adapted to the particular conditions of its preferred habitat. This vertical stratification increases diversity by allowing species with different requirements to coexist in the same geographic area. Holdfasts function as miniature reefs, their complex structure providing hundreds of attachment sites and hiding places. A single large giant kelp holdfast might harbor over 100 species of invertebrates. These holdfast communities are among the most diverse microhabitats in kelp forests. Scientists have found that holdfast biodiversity can rival that of tropical coral reefs when compared at similar spatial scales, highlighting just how productive and diverse these structures are. The connections extend beyond the kelp forest's physical boundaries. Many species move between kelp forests and adjacent habitats, connecting ecosystems. Fish might feed in kelp forests during the day and retreat to rocky reefs at night. Otters range between kelp forests and nearshore areas. Birds forage in kelp forests, but nest on land or nearby islands. These movements create linkages that integrate kelp forests into broader coastal landscapes. Nutrient cycles within kelp forests involve complex feedback loops. Kelp takes up nutrients from the water, incorporating them into tissue. Animals consuming kelp or each other excrete waste, returning nutrients to the water in forms that kelp and other algae can use. Decomposition of dead organisms releases nutrients. Upwelling brings new nutrients from deep water. All these processes interact, maintaining the flow of nutrients through the ecosystem. When any component is disrupted, effects ripple through the nutrient cycles, potentially affecting productivity and species composition. The resilience of kelp forests, their ability to absorb disturbances and recover, depends on this web of connections. When one species declines, others might compensate, maintaining ecosystem function. When kelp is removed from an area, as long as holdfasts remain and conditions are suitable, new growth can occur. When predators maintain control over herbivores, the system remains stable. But resilience has limits. Too many disturbances, too severe or too frequent, can overwhelm an ecosystem's capacity to recover, leading to regime shifts like the transition to urchin barrens. Despite the challenges facing kelp forests, conservation and restoration efforts offer hope. Around the world, scientists, conservation organizations, government agencies, and local communities are working to protect existing kelp forests and restore those that have been lost. These efforts take many forms, from establishing marine protected areas to hands-on restoration projects, to research aimed at understanding how to most effectively support kelp forest health. Marine protected areas represent one of the most powerful tools for kelp forest conservation. By restricting or prohibiting fishing and other extractive activities, MPAs allow ecosystems to maintain or recover more natural structures and functions. In kelp forest MPAs, predator populations including sea otters, sea stars, and predatory fish can recover or remain at healthy levels. With predators present, herbivore populations stay in check, preventing overgrazing. The cascading effects of MPA protection can maintain kelp forests in regions where unprotected forests are declining. Evidence from multiple regions demonstrates MPA effectiveness. In Central California, MPAs have shown benefits for kelp forest ecosystems, with increased biodiversity and ecosystem health inside protected areas compared to adjacent unprotected areas. Similar results have been documented in other regions. MPAs also benefit fisheries through spillover effects, where fish produced in protected areas emigrate to surrounding waters where they can be harvested. This means MPAs can protect ecosystems while also supporting sustainable fisheries, though achieving this balance requires careful design and management. Active restoration of kelp forests typically focuses on reducing herbivore populations, particularly sea urchins, in areas where overgrazing has created or maintained barrens. In Northern California and other regions affected by urchin population explosions, organizations have mobilized teams of divers to manually remove urchins from targeted areas. These divers collect thousands of urchins, either disposing of them or, in some cases, selling them to markets if they're of sufficient quality. Urchin removal is labor-intensive and must often continue for years to allow kelp to reestablish, but it can work. Several restoration sites have seen kelp return after sustained urchin removal efforts. Innovations in restoration techniques continue to develop. Some projects are exploring ways to accelerate kelp recovery by actively outplanting kelp, or by creating artificial substrate where natural substrate is limited. Others are investigating whether urchin predators can be enhanced or reintroduced to create self-sustaining predator populations that would naturally control urchins. Research into kelp genetics and physiology might identify strains better able to tolerate warming waters or other stressors, potentially supporting climate-adapted restoration. The Sussex Kelp Recovery Project in England provides an example of community-driven conservation. The Sussex coast historically supported extensive kelp forests, but bottom-trawling fishing practices damaged or destroyed much of these forests over decades. Trawling physically removes kelp and disturbs the substrate. In 2021, after years of campaigning by conservationists and local communities, a bylaw prohibited trawling in a large area off the Sussex coast. This protection aims to allow kelp forests to recover naturally. Monitoring since the protection began shows gradual signs of recovery, though the process is slower than hoped. Kelp regrowth has been patchy, but the broader ecosystem shows encouraging changes. Fishermen and divers report returning mussel beds, increased sightings of rays and dolphins, and other indicators of improving ecosystem health. The project continues monitoring and working with local communities to support recovery. If successful, kelp restoration in Sussex could provide substantial benefits, with ecosystem services valued at over £3 million annually, including coastal protection, fisheries support, and tourism enhancement. These and other restoration projects face common challenges. Funding is often limited, restricting the scale of interventions. The causes of kelp forest loss must be addressed, or restoration efforts will fail. Removing urchins won't help if warm water continues to stress kelp or if pollution prevents recovery. Monitoring and adaptive management are essential but resource-intensive. Restoration requires patience. Kelp forests can take years to recover fully even after conditions improve. Despite these challenges, restoration successes demonstrate that recovery is possible. Kelp forests have regrown in areas where conditions have improved, whether through urchin removal, otter recovery, reduced pollution, or other changes. These successes provide both ecological benefits and valuable lessons about what works. As restoration science advances and more resources are dedicated to these efforts, the prospects for reversing kelp forest declines improve. Climate change represents a more difficult challenge because addressing it requires the global action on greenhouse gas emissions, not just local conservation measures. Kelp forests will likely continue experiencing thermal stress as oceans warm. But even as we work on climate mitigation, local actions can help. Reducing other stressors can improve kelp resilience, allowing forests to better withstand thermal stress. Protecting predator populations can help maintain ecosystem balance even as conditions change. Marine protected areas can serve as refugia where kelp might persist during marine heat waves or other events. Research into climate adaptation might identify management strategies that support kelp forests in a changing ocean. Community engagement emerges as a critical factor in successful conservation. Local communities that value and use kelp forests can become powerful advocates and active participants in protection and restoration. Indigenous communities whose ancestors relied on kelp forests for millennia hold traditional knowledge about these ecosystems that can inform management. Recreational users, from divers to kayakers, can contribute to monitoring efforts and support conservation policies. Commercial fishers, though sometimes viewed as in conflict with conservation, can be partners when shown how healthy kelp forests support sustainable fisheries. Building these partnerships and ensuring that conservation benefits local communities creates the social foundation for long-term success. Education plays a vital role. Many people don't know kelp forests exist or understand their importance. Increasing public awareness can build support for conservation policies and funding. Schools, aquariums, documentaries, and other educational efforts can share the wonder of kelp forests with broad audiences. As more people understand what's at stake, political will for conservation grows. International cooperation is also important. Kelp forests exist on coastlines of many nations. Some species are widely distributed across multiple countries. Ocean currents don't respect political boundaries. Actions in one nation can affect ecosystems in another. Sharing knowledge, coordinating management strategies, and supporting capacity building in regions with fewer resources all contribute to global kelp forest conservation. The story of kelp forests is, ultimately, a story about connections. Connections between species, from microscopic bacteria to great whales. Connections between kelp and the animals that depend on it. Connections between ocean and land, between coastal communities and the sea. Connections across time, linking the choices we make today to the ecosystems our descendants will inherit. As we work to protect and restore kelp forests, we're not just saving kelp. We're preserving complex webs of life, maintaining vital ecosystem services, protecting biodiversity, and sustaining the many ways humans depend on healthy oceans. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you images of these underwater forests swaying in the eternal motion of the sea. Picture sunlight filtering through golden brown fronds, creating cathedral-like spaces filled with life. Imagine the slow glide of an otter through the kelp, the darting motion of fish in the filtered light, the steady work of countless small creatures maintaining this ecosystem's balance. Feel the coolness of that water, the gentle surge of the current, the peaceful rhythm of the ocean's breathing. Kelp forests remind us of nature's extraordinary creativity, its ability to build complexity from simple elements. From rocky seafloor, cold water, and sunlight, life constructs these magnificent structures that support countless other lives. From individual cells dividing and growing with remarkable speed, forests arise that shelter, feed and sustain entire communities. The same processes that create kelpy forests create all the ecosystems we depend on, all the natural systems that make Earth habitable and beautiful. The challenges facing kelp forests are real and serious, but they're not insurmountable. We possess the knowledge and tools to protect these ecosystems if we choose to use them. We understand what kelp forests need to thrive: cold, nutrient-rich water, stable substrate, balanced predator-prey relationships, protection from overfishing and pollution. We know that maintaining top predators like sea otters prevents trophic cascades. We know that marine protected areas work. We know that restoration, though challenging, is possible. What remains is the will to act, the commitment to prioritizing healthy oceans and the ecosystems they contain. This requires decisions at multiple scales, from international climate agreements to national fisheries policies to local protection measures to individual choices about consumption and advocacy. Each scale matters. Each action contributes. The small choices accumulate into larger changes. The efforts of dedicated individuals and communities ripple outward, inspiring others and building momentum for broader transformation. If you've found this journey through kelp forests meaningful, I invite you once more to like this video and subscribe to the Sleepy Science Society. Your support helps these explorations reach more people sharing science and wonder with anyone seeking knowledge and rest. Perhaps share this with someone who might find comfort in these gentle dives into the natural world. Perhaps leave a comment sharing your own experiences with kelp forests or oceans, adding your voice to this community of curious, thoughtful people. But for now, simply rest. Let go of all the information, all the details. You don't need to remember everything. What matters is the feeling, the sense of connection to something vast and beautiful, the understanding that even as you sleep, life continues in countless forms across this extraordinary planet. Kelp sways in dark waters. Fish move through those swaying fronds. Otters rest, wrapped in kelp, rising and falling with the waves. All of it continues, patient and persistent, part of the ancient rhythms of ocean and life. Your breathing has slowed. Your body has softened. The day's concerns have faded into the background, replaced by the gentle motion of imagined currents and the peaceful presence of underwater forests. You are safe. You are comfortable. You can rest completely. Tomorrow, when you wake, the ocean will still be there, still breathing, still supporting these forests and all the life they contain. And you'll have another opportunity to care for this world, to make choices that protect what matters, to contribute to the ongoing story of life on Earth. But tonight, you don't need to do anything. Tonight, you can simply be, floating peacefully in the knowledge that you're part of something larger, connected to the kelp and the otters, to the fish and the currents, to all the living systems that make this planet home. Rest well. Dream of forests beneath the waves, of sunlight filtering through water, of life finding endless ways to flourish. Let the ocean's ancient rhythm carry you gently into sleep. Good night.